a young woman was seen entering an apartment building, but the cameras never saw her leave. When she was reported missing, all eyes were on that apartment, but no forensic evidence was recovered. Would a purely circumstantial case ever hold up in court? I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. Welcome to Crime Lines. I cannot believe it is April already, and I hope everyone has found some new podcasts to listen to while I was on my break. It was so nice to take some time to get away out of the day-to-day. I have a new project I'm working on behind the scenes, so I definitely needed some rest before I jump into that. I will give you more information on that later. But I did want to announce some meetups I have planned. I will be in Birmingham, Alabama, the first weekend in May, and then in London, the second weekend in June, and then in Austin, Texas, the last weekend in August. Check it out in the description box on where to get tickets and, if applicable, what the Crime Lines coupon discount code is. But of course, this podcast is not about me. It's not about all these travels I'm on. It's about getting into these cases. So let's go ahead and start with Kelly Dwyer. Kelly was born in Chicago and she grew up in the Chicago suburbs. She was super active in high school. She played tennis. She was part of the yearbook club. She was on the student newspaper. After high school, however, Kelly found it a little hard to figure out what she wanted to do for the rest of her life and bounced around a bit without the structure of those school activities and clubs. She floated from job to job for a little while. Eventually, Kelly moved an hour and a half north of Chicago to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which was a positive move for her. Always athletic, Kelly became a yoga instructor. In addition to teaching yoga, she worked for Lululemon, which is an athletic clothing company, as well as working as a nanny for a well-known executive chef. She filled her hours with yoga, work, and going out with friends and out on dates. Though Kelly did not have a steady boyfriend, she did have an ongoing, non-exclusive relationship with Chris Zacco that started in late 2012. Kelly was 26 and Chris was about 11 years older than her. He was more settled in life. He graduated Boston University with a business degree. He got into IT, worked for the New York Yankees for a little bit before moving on to another job. At the point Kelly met him, he was the Chief Information Officer of a relocation management company in Milwaukee. Chris and Kelly had a casual relationship, and Kelly knew they were not exclusive. She dated other people, but she seemed to always end up back with Chris. Friends had the impression that she was more infatuated with Chris than he was with her. He was really the type of guy Kelly wanted to be with, but he wasn't always around. He would disappear for a bit and then call Kelly up to see if she wanted to go out, and then they would. They would see each other for a few weeks, he would disappear again, show back up, and on and on. Chris would later refer to this relationship as a friends with benefits situation. The two were seeing each other in October 2013 when 27-year-old Kelly Dwyer did not show up for work one Saturday. It was Saturday, October 12th, 2013, and her coworkers tried to call her on her cell phone repeatedly because it just was not like Kelly to miss work without calling. They even went to her apartment, but she didn't appear to be home. Her family also hadn't heard from her in a few days, so her mother called the police to report Kelly missing. Kelly was always active on social media, so of course the family had already checked that out. But her posting seemed to stop on Thursday night, which was around the same time she appeared to stop using her cell phone. Kelly's mom did have access to Kelly's phone records, probably because they were on the same plan. There were no outgoing texts or calls after Thursday night. The phone did receive a text on Friday around 7:30 in the morning, but Kelly did not respond to it. Pulling more detailed phone records, the police saw that Kelly's phone had last synced to the Apple iCloud at 10:08 in the morning on Friday, just hours after that last incoming text. The phone at the time was located on the east side of Milwaukee. That was the end of the activity on the phone, and the calls and the texts from concerned friends and family never went through. So obviously, Thursday night became a very important point in the timeline, and the police wanted to build out Kelly's activities that evening. In talking with friends, they learned that on Thursday, October 10th, Kelly was seen with Chris Zacco at a bar near his condo on the east side of Milwaukee. The two bumped into some friends and they hung out for a bit. Kelly and Chris left the bar to go pick up a pizza from a nearby place, and then they brought it back to the bar with them. They sat outside with their friends while eating and chatting. Kelly and Chris then left together, heading towards Chris's apartment building. That was the last Kelly had been seen, so of course the investigation ended up on Chris Zacco's doorstep on Monday, October 14th, 4 days after Kelly was last heard from. While Chris was being questioned, other officers were in the security office going over footage from the building surveillance cameras. Chris was willing to speak with the police, and he said that he and Kelly saw each other a couple of times a week to quote-unquote party. And he was clear what he meant by that. Basically drink, occasionally use cocaine, and have sex. And that's what he said happened the night he last saw Kelly. Chris said that after the bar, they went back to his condo very late. Kelly didn't have work the next day, so she wasn't concerned with going home so she could get up in time the next morning. He said that back at his apartment, they did a couple of lines of cocaine, had some more drinks, and then Kelly performed oral sex on him before they fell asleep on the couch around 6 a.m. Chris said he woke up around 9 a.m. to Kelly saying she was leaving, and then he heard the door click. This was not exactly the same story he had told Kelly's boss over the weekend. Obviously, family and friends were calling everyone who might know where Kelly was, and Chris was one of those people reached out to. When he talked to Kelly's boss, he said that she had left at 7 a.m. But to the police, he said it was 9, and then he said he spent about half an hour just lying around before getting up to get ready for work. He was working from home, but he needed a document that he had left at the office. He left to go to his office, but decided about halfway there to just turn around and go home. He figured he didn't really need the thing from the office right away, and he was hungover, so he'd rather just be at his condo. The police were able to confirm a lot of this, but not all of it, with security footage. The footage showed Kelly and Chris coming and going from his apartment a few times on Thursday night, only to come back for good at 2:37 a.m. And, as Chris said, he left at 10:06 a.m. on Friday, which was 2 minutes before the last time Kelly's phone had linked to the iCloud. The phone was at that point either powered down or destroyed. Chris then came back at 10:22, which was in line with driving halfway to work and then coming back. It's what the police didn't see between those 2 points that concerned them. They didn't see Kelly leave the building. Not at 7 a.m., not at 9 a.m., not ever. So the investigator watching the video in the security office texted the ones who were questioning Chris up in his condo. And they texted the words, quote, "She doesn't come out." And the investigators knew exactly what was meant. They continued to question Chris, trying to build out more of his timeline of that weekend. He said he worked from home until about 6:30. He then took some sports equipment to his parents' house to store it there, since his apartment was getting cluttered. His parents did back this up. The next day, he went Christmas shopping, unaware Kelly had never made it to work until someone called him. He texted Kelly on Sunday and Monday to ask her where she was and to just let her know that everyone was worried, but he didn't hear back. After the interview with Chris, the police wanted to search his apartment. He consented to them looking around, which they did, and saw nothing glaring. They knew they needed a more thorough forensic search, so in part they used Chris's admission that he had used drugs in the apartment as probable cause for a full search warrant. And they did find drugs. They found cocaine, pot, hydrocodone, and oxycodone. As for evidence of what happened to Kelly, they didn't find much. It was later said that the police noticed the apartment had been cleaned recently with one of the bathrooms smelling heavily of bleach, and that they found a trash bag with a bunch of bleach wipes in it. That said, this observation did not appear in the police reports at the time, and that includes the bit about the trash bag of bleach wipes being found. It was only brought up later, and I personally always lean more on the earliest record when memories are the freshest. But there was something that was noted in the report, and that was that they noticed there was no shower curtain in the guest bathroom, even though the shower rod and the rings that held the curtain were still in place. There were also no bath mats in that room. So the police then brought in a cadaver dog, Molly, and brought her up to Chris's floor. When Molly walked down the hallway, she first passed by Chris's apartment without stopping, but on a second pass, she went into the apartment. She alerted to areas in Chris's bathroom, at the foot of his bed, on a t-shirt, and on a cleaning pad for a Swiffer sweeper. Taking Molly down to the parking area, she indicated on a number of other areas, including on a shovel and a dumpster. Days later, Molly was brought back through, and she also indicated on the driver's side door of Chris's car and on a yellow toolbox in his trunk. They took swabs of all of these places, and on the public ones, like the dumpster and the shovel, they didn't get any relevant DNA. What that told the police was that Molly was alerting to a residual odor, something that had been there and wasn't there anymore. Because the dumpster held trash and the shovel was in a trash room, it's believed these weren't actually connected to what happened to Kelly, but were more odors from shedded skin, blood, or even nail clippings from people's trash. The indications in Chris's non-public apartment seemed a lot more significant. That said, though Kelly's DNA was found in the apartment, it really wasn't anywhere that a competent defense attorney couldn't explain away, based on her just being over there multiple times. There was nothing as obvious as blood spatter found. Now, in addition to the search of his home, his car, places in his apartment building, the investigators also searched Chris's electronic devices. On Chris's phone, they found some texts Chris had sent to Kelly on Friday. One was at 4 p.m. and the other was around 8:45 p.m. And he was basically asking how she was, if she was hungover, and said he hoped that they hadn't ruined her day off. There were no replies from Kelly to these. They then saw that Chris's phone was mostly off for 17 hours, starting on the evening of Friday the 11th, the day he claimed Kelly left his apartment, until some point on October 12th. Also on the phone, they found videos and still images of Kelly that disturbed the investigators. None were from that night. They were from a few weeks previous. In some of the photos, Kelly was in Chris's bed and she appeared unconscious. In one video from about 3 weeks before her disappearance, Kelly and Chris were engaged in a sex act in which she was tied up with neckties and she was clearly struggling to breathe. Kelly's friends would tell the police that they had seen her with bruises and would ask if she was okay, and she would laugh it off, saying she just had a wild night. So there was no reason to believe at that point that the video was of something non-consensual. However, it's not clear if Kelly knew it was being recorded. But it was looking at Chris's other devices that the investigators found something much worse, something illegal. On an external hard drive found in Chris's spare room, they found video of child sexual abuse materials. Chris denied knowing that those videos were on that hard drive. He was an IT guy. He picked up the hard drive back in Boston from someone else. An examination showed that the hard drive had not been used since 2009, 4 years before. But possessing the images is illegal even if no one looked at them for a while. So Chris was then charged with possession of child sexual abuse materials, as well as being charged with drug charges related to what was found in that search of his condo. But nothing found led to an arrest for involvement in Kelly's disappearance. Chris was interviewed at least one more time about the disappearance, and his story was almost identical with some minor changes. Like, instead of saying goodbye to Kelly when she left, he said this time he only knew she left because he heard the door click. But just because they didn't find direct evidence didn't mean they found Chris credible or believed he didn't have involvement. Quite the opposite. After taking what Chris told them happened that weekend and security footage pulled from his building's cameras, they realized his story was not adding up. So let's go over some of this footage. When Chris arrived back to the garage after his supposed half drive to work, he opened his trunk. The footage is pretty blurry, so you can't see exactly what was in there, but there was a yellow object and a gray object. The yellow thing was the toolbox they had found when they searched his car. It's unknown what the gray object was, as it was not in the car when they searched it, but the investigators would later have a theory, so just store that in the back of your mind for now. Rather than going up to his apartment to work all day like he said, Chris was seen leaving again in his car at 10:37 and returning at 10:52. Fast forward over an hour later to around noon when Chris got into his car again. Then at 1:43 p.m., he got out of his car and walked back to his apartment. Then, 2 hours later, he brought a rolling duffel bag to his car and put it in the trunk. This was a bat bag, and it was left at his parents' house, so it was accounted for. An hour and a half after this, so we're talking just after 5 p.m., Chris brought down a small golf bag on his shoulder and placed it at the rear door of the car. Finally, at 6:15 p.m., the car left for the evening. Chris was not seen coming back to his apartment until the next day. He went back to his apartment, but then left and stayed out overnight again. The investigators were able to learn a bit more about where Chris went when he wasn't at home, thanks to a tipster who saw the news of his arrest on those other charges. The caller said that his sister, Megan, had been in a serious relationship with Chris for the last 3 years. From Megan's understanding, based on what Chris explicitly told her, they were in an exclusive relationship. She did not know he was seeing other people. And while Kelly knew that she and Chris weren't exclusive, she had no idea that he had a girlfriend who thought they were in a long-term relationship and had a future together. The police went to talk to Megan to see if she knew anything, and they found it interesting that Chris didn't mention her at all in his interviews, because it turned out he spent a lot of that weekend with her, starting on Friday night. The two had plans for a 7 p.m. dinner, and Megan told the police she was annoyed with Chris because he was over an hour late. She had tried to reach him, but he didn't answer his phone. When Chris finally showed up, he said he was late because he had brought some stuff over to his mom's house. He couldn't call and let Megan know he was running late because he was having some type of phone issue and said he needed a new SIM card. According to Megan, Chris then spent the night and left around 7:30 in the morning on Saturday, and he was gone for several hours. They met back up later that evening because they had dinner plans with another couple. Chris showed up with a block of cheese and gave it to Megan, saying it was a gift for her parents, who were coming in for a visit the next week. Giving cheese as a random gift seems like the most Wisconsin thing I've ever heard of. Chris told Megan he had picked it up when he was out in Madison trying to get football tickets. Chris then spent the night on Saturday with Megan, and they went out to a Sunday brunch. This brunch was significant for Megan because while she didn't know that Chris was seeing other people, she did know that their relationship had been in a rough patch. They had all but stopped having sex due to what she was told was Chris's impotency. And then she had the opportunity to relocate to Denver, Colorado, and she wanted to go. She mentioned it to Chris, and he said he would not go with her if she moved. Sex isn't the only component to a relationship, but knowing that Chris also wouldn't follow her for a job opportunity did make her unsure of what their relationship dynamic really was and if they had a future together. In the end, Megan decided not to move because she thought she and Chris would work through it and stay together long term. But at that brunch, even though Megan had already decided to stay in Wisconsin, Chris told her he had changed his mind. He was ready to go to Denver with her. Megan took this as a good sign of his commitment to their relationship. They ended up spending the rest of the day together until Chris left for Chicago for an overnight business trip. That was the last she saw him, and next thing she knew, he was on the news, having been arrested and being tied to a missing woman. Of course, the investigators wanted to fill in the gaps in this timeline of the weekend, particularly after Chris left Megan's apartment on Saturday morning and was gone for several hours with his phone off before he reappeared with a block of cheese. But they wouldn't really start investigating that until after they finished their interview with Megan, because they had some more questions for her. They brought photos of Chris's apartment to this interview. These were all taken during the execution of the search warrant, and they asked Megan if anything looked out of place. Megan said she hadn't been there in a few weeks, but she zeroed in pretty quickly on the guest bathroom. She said the last time she was there was a shower curtain, a bath mat, and decorative towels that she had purchased. She also noticed that the grommets that held the curtain looked bent, and she had no idea how they would have gotten that way. It pretty much looked like someone grabbed the shower curtain and yanked it down, rather than detaching it properly. In looking in another photo, Megan mentioned that Chris's travel golf bag wasn't there. It had been sitting in the living room on the floor for weeks, and she remembered it because she had to step over it again and again. Chris did tell the police and Megan that he moved equipment that was cluttering up his condo to his parents' house, but this bag was not one of those things. The bag was not found in the condo, Chris's car, or at his parents' house. It was gone. After they finished interviewing Megan, it was time to try to figure out where Chris was on Saturday morning and afternoon, and they started with that block of cheese. It was a half-pound bought at the Mouse House Cheese House in Windsor, Wisconsin, which is north of Madison and about an hour and a half from Milwaukee. Though Chris paid cash, they were able to look up the purchase, and it was made at 9:55 a.m. The next provable point on the timeline was at 12:11 p.m., 2.5 hours later. Chris was now in Delafield at a Sports Authority where he bought shoes and a lemonade, this time using his credit card, so this was easily traced. Surveillance video showed Chris returning to his apartment at 2:40 p.m. He carried in a white trash bag and possibly something else. The investigators believed it may have been cleaning supplies, but it's not clear. By taking these points, starting from when Chris left Megan's house, to the cheese store, to the Sports Authority where he bought the shoes, and to his apartment, there turned out to be a pretty significant gap. Megan's house to the cheese place was right on time. But from the cheese house to the Sports Authority was a 47-minute drive, but it took Chris 2 hours and 16 minutes. That leaves us with about 90 minutes unaccounted for. So where was he for that hour and a half? The police believed it was in that time that Chris disposed of Kelly's body. And here is their theory of what happened. They suspected that Kelly died in Chris's home, likely during a risky sex act in the early morning hours of Friday, October 11th. To back up this possible cause of death, they had Chris's video of Kelly struggling to breathe previously, but also they had spoken with other women Chris had dated casually. They told the police that they engaged in edge play with him as well. Edge play is any consensual sexual activity that comes with a moderate to significant risk of physical harm. In Chris's case, asphyxiation of his partner was the risk he enjoyed. As a couple, they would come up with a safeguard, a signal of when it was time to stop and let the woman breathe. One woman told the police about an incident where Chris repeatedly ignored the signal and she had to fight him off or else she feared she was going to die. This had gone from consensual to non-consensual very quickly. And investigators believed that was what happened to Kelly, only she wasn't able to fight Chris off like the other woman who had survived. When Chris realized that Kelly had stopped breathing, he decided not to call for help. Instead, he decided to cover it up. He wrapped her body in a shower curtain, put it into this missing large golf bag, and then put the golf bag in the back of his vehicle. This bag was, in the investigators' collective opinion, the gray object in his trunk seen on the CCTV footage. Chris then drove some sports equipment out to his parents' house as part of the cover-up. Maybe he thought people or security cameras had caught him putting the golf bag in his car, so he needed an explanation for that, so he brought some other equipment over to his parents' house. After he dropped the stuff at his parents' house, the police believed Chris then showed up at Megan's with Kelly's body still in his vehicle. Megan had told the police that Chris was not calm, cool, and collected when he showed up. He was actually restless, and he was fidgety all night. He sweated so profusely that she had to change the bed sheets. At the time, she didn't know why. According to the investigators' theory, Chris's car and Kelly's body sat outside Megan's house overnight until he left at 7:30 in the morning. He then drove out of town looking for a place to leave the body. To give him an excuse for being out in that area, he stopped at the cheese store just in case he had been spotted. He then spent that gap in his timeline between the cheese house and the Sports Authority, hiding Kelly's body. He then went and bought new shoes to replace the dirty, muddy, or possibly bloody ones that he wore while disposing of the body. Then he returned to his apartment and continued to clean. This is a very good theory consistent with the evidence they had. The problem was, they didn't have much evidence, and a lot of theories could have fit into all of those little holes. For one thing, they still didn't have a body, let alone a body that was found between the cheese house and the sporting goods store. And then those surveillance cameras that didn't capture Kelly leaving the building, they also did not spot exactly when Chris moved her body to his car. Back in March 2021, I covered the case of Karabu Mukwena, and in that case, the surveillance cameras got everything. That was not the case here. Chris could have made it from his apartment to the elevator and to the garage without encountering any cameras. But once he got into the garage, there were cameras. He was spotted a number of times on Friday coming and going. However, these were motion-activated cameras, not like the ones inside the building that continuously recorded. These would only record if they were triggered, and they didn't always trigger even when there was motion. And we know that because there were points where a car would be parked in one recording, but then it would be gone the next time it picked up, having not tripped the camera when it left. So it was possible that the time he brought Kelly's body down to his car in that travel golf bag, the camera wasn't activated. And that would have been exceptionally good luck, that at the time he was moving a bag large enough to conceal a body, the camera just happened not to go on. Now, was it possible that he did get the body out of the apartment a different way, knowing that there were cameras in the garage? Maybe he drove around the corner, parked his car, and then went to get the bag, managing to avoid cameras all the way out. That's possible. Another theory is that Kelly's body was sent down the garbage chute. Her DNA was found in the chute, but also so was Chris's and a lot of other people's. We tend to touch the things we throw away, so it's very possible this was innocent transfer. And that's the problem with this case. There were too many gaps and too many maybes and too many what ifs to bring this to trial. But that didn't mean Chris wasn't going to prison. He went on trial for the child sexual abuse materials in November 2014 and was convicted on most counts. A month after that, he pleaded out on the drug charges. Though Kelly's disappearance was not allowed in at trial as it wasn't relevant, it was allowed in at sentencing in January 2015, and Chris was given a 19-year sentence. With Chris behind bars and not going anywhere for a while, everyone still held on to hope that they would find enough to prosecute him eventually for homicide in Kelly Dwyer's death. Finding Kelly's body would go a long way towards getting justice, but for her father, finding her body so that he could bury her would be the first step towards his own healing. He later said the worst part of the entire ordeal was knowing that she was dead, but not knowing where her remains were. A few months after Chris was sentenced for those other charges, Kelly's father announced the family would be conducting more searches for Kelly's body. And then literally 2 days after that announcement, Kelly Dwyer's remains were found. On May 1st, 2015, a man in Jefferson County, Wisconsin, was out in the woods looking for shedded deer antlers when he saw something white. He first thought it was a deer bone until he noticed a human skull. He called the police. This location was between Madison and Milwaukee, and the skeletal remains, which were almost entirely intact, were female. so this was immediately considered to be a possibility for Kelly Dwyer. There were no clues or jewelry nearby to aid in the identification, but they hoped they would not have to wait months on DNA, so they tried dental records. The family, however, didn't know what dentist Kelly saw in Milwaukee, but thankfully, they had already hired a PI to help them with the case, and he was able to track down Kelly's dentist. A few days later, the body was positively identified as 27-year-old Kelly Dwyer, who at that point had been missing for a year and a half. The area where Kelly's body was found was thick and overgrown, not visible from any road or highway. But more importantly, it was found within the zone that Chris could have gone in those missing 90 minutes. The spot was actually just 13 miles from where he bought the shoes, and the drive time test showed it was only 22 minutes away. Now that said, that was about the only evidence linking Chris to Kelly's death. The position of the skeleton, with one leg twisted and an arm pulled behind the back, did indicate the body may have been unnaturally folded into something before being dumped. However, what that may have been was unknown because it wasn't left at the scene. The missing golf bag remained missing. Also missing was any hint of a shower curtain or a bath mat, let alone ones that also matched Chris's home. A search of the area didn't locate anything from Chris's apartment in the vicinity of the body. Beyond that, they couldn't determine the cause or manner of death on autopsy. The investigators believed Kelly was strangled or suffocated, or a combination of both during sex, but due to the state of the remains, they couldn't prove it. This investigation, trying to find some direct evidence to tie Chris Zacco to Kelly Dwyer's murder, went on for another 2 years, until the state realized there just was not going to be any more evidence. This was going to be a circumstantial case, and it was time to take it to trial. On May 8th, 2017, Chris Zacco was charged with first-degree reckless homicide under the theory that he knew restricting someone's breathing was dangerous and did it anyway. He was also charged with hiding a corpse and strangulation/suffocation based on the video on his phone. To show a pattern of this type of behavior, they did have the video of the previous encounter with Kelly, plus the ex of Chris's who would go on to testify about her experience. She was willing, with her identity protected from the public, to tell the jury in detail about a sexual act where Chris purposely blocked her breathing against her consent and ignored her pleas to stop. When she was unable to breathe, she had to force her way free. To the prosecution, this helped show a pattern of recklessness and disregard for the safety of Chris's sexual partners. And according to an inmate housed with Chris knew this woman was a dangerous witness against him. The man came forward saying that Chris admitted guilt to him. He said Kelly died during sex and that he got her body out of the apartment by wrapping it in a shower curtain and using the building trash chute that went down to the basement. He also said Chris asked him for help in silencing the ex-girlfriend who was going to testify about the sexual violence perpetrated on her. His information added another charge to the list, and Chris was then charged with witness intimidation. So for the jury to believe that Chris did not commit this murder, they would have to find it reasonable that Kelly, in spite of always using the same path when she came and went from Chris's condo on Thursday night, went an entirely different way to leave Friday morning, a way that avoided the cameras. They would also have to find it possible that Kelly completely stopped using her phone and her social media while she was still at Chris's condo, and then didn't use them again until she died at a later time. Someone else would have had to have picked her up, killed her, and just so happened to leave her body in an area Chris happened to be the following day. And Kelly went missing on a weekend when Chris decided to start his Christmas shopping in October and drove nearly 2 hours away to buy half a pound of cheese, and that he decided to make this long trip in spite of the fact that he said his phone wasn't working properly. The defense took advantage of the lack of direct physical evidence, as you would expect, and they tried to dismantle the circumstances. Chris's phone really just happened to not work that weekend. The state inferred that it meant he turned it off, and the inference was that he turned it off in order to hide where he was because he was disposing of Kelly's body. It was an inference built on an inference when it really could have just been that his phone didn't work. They also challenged the strongest evidence, which was that Kelly Dwyer was not seen on CCTV leaving the apartment, and the evidence from the cadaver dog. The police said they didn't see Kelly leave on any of the videos. However, there was a way to leave without encountering a camera, which the defense mapped out for the jury. Further, the state's proof that Kelly didn't show up on any other cameras ended up being a matter of trust because the police failed to preserve that evidence. They only kept some of the footage, not all of it, so the defense couldn't watch it to be sure that Kelly didn't appear elsewhere. As for it being odd that Kelly would have left in a different way than usual, they pointed out that Kelly wasn't new to the building. Not only did she visit Chris repeatedly over the previous year, she also nannied for someone who lived there. So she knew the different ways to come and go, and it wasn't outrageous to think she may have gone a different direction that time. And as for the cadaver dog evidence, the defense brought in an expert to question the accuracy of the dog on that day, in those conditions, with that handler. The expert testified about how handlers can unintentionally give their dogs cues that then lead to false results. Chris Zacco opted not to take the stand in his own defense. But by the time the jury took the case, one of the charges had been dropped. Mid-trial, the witness intimidation charge was abandoned because the jailhouse informant's credibility was in serious question. I know, we're all shocked. A jailhouse informant asking for consideration in his own sentence in exchange for testimony may not have been telling the truth. So on the remaining 3 charges that went to the jury, first-degree reckless homicide, hiding a corpse, and strangulation, 43-year-old Chris Zacco was found guilty of all 3. At sentencing, Kelly's parents spoke about how they suffered without their daughter, and her mother told the court how angry she was that Kelly was left just dumped and alone for a year and a half. Though Chris did not speak, his attorney did. Having already lost the trial and hoping to spare his client another lengthy prison sentence, he did not argue innocence. He argued instead that the evidence showed that this was, at most, an accident during a consensual sexual act and not homicide. The jury then recommended a sentence of 22 years. The judge, however, disregarded it and instead sentenced Chris to 31 years behind bars, followed by 19 years of supervised release. The judge said things may have started consensual, but became, quote, an utter disregard for human life. This new sentence was consecutive to the sentence Chris was already serving for the child sexual abuse materials and the drug charges. According to the Wisconsin Department of Corrections, he will be eligible for release in 2065 when he is 90 years old. Chris is appealing on a number of issues, and thank you to the Wisconsin courts for uploading briefs to their website. Many of the facts for this episode came from Chris's filing as well as the state's response. As for Kelly Dwyer's family, every victory from finding her body to getting a conviction have been little consolation for losing their loved one. And for Kelly's last moments to be a graphic look into her private life couldn't have been easy. But those who knew Kelly don't remember her for those things like the public might. They remember her as one of the happiest people who was full of life, and that those around her couldn't help but feel uplifted after spending time with her. And that beauty and energy is how they will remember her. Thank you for listening. You can find Crime Lines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crime Lines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crime Lines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.